Cleopatra's night guards, the feline secret of Egypt's last pharaoh. Imagine this. Alexandria, around 34 BC, oil lamps flicker against walls painted with gold and lapis. Outside, Rome is tightening its grip on the Mediterranean. Inside the private quarters of Cleopatra VII Philopater, something far quieter rules the darkness. Not soldiers, not eunuchs, but cats. One curls at the foot of her bed. Another watches the doorway, eyes reflecting lamplight like twin embers. Two later writers, Cleopatra is the femme fatale of the East. But to Egyptians, a queen resting under the gaze of cats makes perfect sense. So here's the puzzle. Why would one of the most powerful women of the ancient world surround herself with an animal that, to outsiders, was just a pet? But to Egyptians, bordered on the divine. Join me as we decode what Cleopatra's world really believed about cats' protection, politics, religion, and propaganda, and what this bedroom myth reveals about the last pharaoh of Egypt. To understand Cleopatra's mysterious companions, we need to wind the clock back more than 1,000 years before her birth. By the time Cleopatra VII came to the throne in 51 BC, the cat had already completed one of history's most successful PR campaigns. In the Nile Valley, cats were not simply pets. They were symbols of divine power, domestic protection, and royal legitimacy. Egyptian texts and archaeology showed that, by the Middle Kingdom around 2001, BC cats were already present in Egyptian art, especially in hunting scenes and domestic imagery. Over time, the cat became closely associated with Bastet, or Bastet, a goddess who began as a lioness and later, in the first millennium BC, was increasingly depicted with the head of a cat. She embodied fertility, motherhood, joy, and household protection. At Bubastis, in the eastern Nile Delta, Bastet's main cult center. Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described enormous festivals in her honor, with tens of thousands of pilgrims traveling by boat. He also wrote that when a house cat died in Egypt, members of the household would shave their eyebrows in mourning, an extreme sign of respect by Greek standards. Archaeology backs this reverence. Excavations at sites like Saqqara and Bubastis have uncovered vast cat cemeteries. Mummified cats wrapped in linen, sometimes placed in decorated coffins. These were offerings to Bastet, donations to temples, and, in some cases, beloved animals given a carefully ritualized burial. By Cleopatra's era, Egypt was no longer ruled by a native dynasty, but by the Ptolemies, a Greek Macedonian royal family that took power after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC. Cleopatra herself was the last of that line, reigning from 51 to 30 BC. The Ptolemies were outsiders ruling an ancient, proud civilization. To survive, they adopted key Egyptian symbols, and cats, together with the gods they represented, were part of that toolkit. Ptolemaic rulers styled themselves as pharaohs, participated in native cults, and sponsored temples to Egyptian deities, including those linked to felines. So, in Cleopatra's Egypt, cats carried at least 3 layers of meaning. Religious, linked to Bastet, and sometimes to lioness goddesses like Sekhet, representing protection and divine wrath against enemies. Domestic, controllers of vermin, protectors of grain, guardians of the household from both practical and symbolic threats. Political, a visible connection between the Ptolemaic court and traditional Egyptian identity, a way to show that the Greek pharaoh respected the old gods. When we imagine Cleopatra's private life, including the famous idea of cats in her bedroom, we're really looking at the endpoint of centuries of Egyptian feline veneration, refracted through Greek and Roman eyes. But reverence alone doesn't explain why Cleopatra, a ruler fighting for survival against Rome, might choose cats as close companions. Her life unfolded in a world on the brink. Born in 69 BC, Cleopatra grew up in a palace that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions in the cosmopolitan city of Alexandria. By the time she quarreled with her younger brother Ptolemy, the 13th, in 51 BC, Egypt was effectively a client state of Rome. Every move she made was judged by Roman politicians, generals, and creditors. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, and Cleopatra famously allied herself with him. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, she turned to Mark Antony, another Roman power broker, forging both a political and personal partnership. Together, they attempted to build a new Eastern power bloc centered on Egypt. For Rome, this was intolerable. B31 BC, at the naval battle of Actium, Octavian Caesar's adopted heir, later known as Augustus, destroyed Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Waiting adier Alexandria fell. In 30 BC, both Antony and Cleopatra died, and Egypt became a Roman province. So where do cats fit into this catastrophe? First, as symbols of Egyptian identity and religion, cats and their associated cults were part of what set Egypt apart from Rome. Roman and Greek writers often emphasized Egyptian animal worship as strange, even excessive. The idea of a queen so devoted to cats that they shared her most private spaces would have struck Roman readers as both exotic and faintly absurd, a perfect motif for propaganda. Second, as domestic guardians, cats were literally part of palace life. Ancient palaces were not sterile marble sets. They were sprawling complexes with storerooms, food supplies, and insects and rodents. Cats were practical, living pest control. For a ruler like Cleopatra, whose legitimacy depended on appearing as an Egyptian pharaoh to her subjects, having cats visible in temples, courtyards, and living spaces wasn't just convenient. It was culturally coherent. Third, as political symbols, animal cults including those centered on cats suffered dramatically in the aftermath of Cleopatra's defeat. Under Roman rule, many temples lost royal funding. Over the next few centuries, the old animal cults declined, their mummified offerings eventually becoming sources of fertilizer or curiosities for later explorers. The fall of Cleopatra was not just a political revolution. It was a gradual unraveling of the world that had elevated cats to near-divine status. The royal palace where Cleopatra once walked possibly with cats in her trainers, now underwater off the coast of modern Alexandria, submerged by centuries of earthquakes, subsidence, and rising seas. So, did Cleopatra really keep cats in her bedroom? Here's where we strip away the romantic filters and let the evidence speak. First, what our ancient sources say. Major writers who discuss Cleopatra: Plutarch, Diocletian, Strabo, and others focus on her political skills, her charisma, her relationships with Caesar and Antony, and her dramatic death. They do discuss Egyptian animal cults in general, with stories about sacred animals being fiercely protected. But there is no surviving ancient text that specifically describes Cleopatra's private bedchamber filled with cats. What we do have is widespread cat imagery in Ptolemaic era, objects, amulets, and domestic artifacts, cat mummies, and Bastet shrines still active in Cleopatra's lifetime. Greek and Roman accounts of Egyptians treating cats with extreme respect, to the point where harming a cat could trigger riots. From this, historians infer that cats were extremely common in Egyptian households, including elite residences. It would be surprising if cats were not present in Cleopatra's palace. They likely roamed storerooms, courtyards, and living quarters, much like palace animals in other societies. What about the bedroom detail? That appears to be a modern extrapolation. If Egyptian elites valued cats, and if cats moved freely through houses, then surely they crossed into private rooms, including bedrooms. Over time, this inference hardened into a vivid image. Cleopatra asleep, surrounded by cats. It's a powerful mental picture, but it's not a recorded eyewitness account. Here's where AI helps us make this distinction clear. By visually separating evidence, probability, and myth, we can decode Cleopatra's mysterious companions with intellectual honesty. The most defensible conclusion is this. Cleopatra lived in a culture that revered cats and integrated them deeply into both religious and domestic life. As Queen of Egypt, actively aligning herself with native traditions, she almost certainly encountered cats daily, and likely kept them close in palace spaces. The specific image of cats as intimate bedroom guardians is a modern narrative device, consistent with Egyptian norms, but not directly recorded by ancient authors. In other words, the truth's less about a single room and more about an entire civilization that wrapped its identity around an animal. Cleopatra's world ended in 30 BC, but the image of the Egyptian cat did not. In late antiquity and the medieval period, many of the temples that once mummified cats were abandoned, their buried offerings looted or forgotten. Yet the association between Egypt and cats slowly filtered into European consciousness, thanks to classical texts and, centuries later, two travelers in Egypt. By the 19th century, as European powers excavated and often exploited Egyptian sites, crates of cat mummies were shipped to ports like Liverpool and London. Some were studied. Others were ground up for fertilizer, an uncomfortable reminder that sacred symbols can become commodities when cultures collide. At the same time, artists, writers, and later filmmakers turned Cleopatra herself into a symbol of seduction, of exoticism, of doomed resistance to Rome. In this retelling, cats became part of her iconography, sleek, mysterious, and ever-present, even when the historical record is silent. Today, the idea that Egyptians worshipped cats is one of the most persistent popular beliefs about the ancient Nile. It's not entirely wrong, but it compresses a complex reality: temple cults, domestic utility, emotional attachment, into a single, catchy press. Modern internet culture has added another twist. Cats are now global icons, from memes to mascots. When people imagine Cleopatra with cats, they're blending ancient Bastet with modern cat culture, projecting our current obsessions backward in time. But there is a serious side to this story. The way we picture Cleopatra's mysterious companions reveals how we use animals to talk about power, gender, and otherness. For Romans, Egyptian animal cults were an easy target, an example of how strange the East was. For later European artists, Cleopatra with cats signaled sensuality and exotic luxury. For us, in the age of AI imagery, the same motif becomes an opportunity, a way to reconstruct the ancient world visually while marking the boundary between what is real and what we respectfully imagine. So the next time you see Cleopatra portrayed with a cat in her arms, or a feline at the foot of her bed, remember, you're relooking at the layered echo of a real cultural practice, deep reverence for cats filtered through 2,000 years of storytelling. If you want to keep exploring the unseen past, check out our latest deep dive on how Roman propaganda reinvented Cleopatra after her death, right here. Don't forget to hit the bell and subscribe to the AI Ancient Archive. We redecoding history every week.